Wait, we're going to talk about identity politics in this campaign and not talk about
Childless
J.D.
cat
Vance
ladies.
and women and parents.
Don't you have a flight to catch, Carlos?
From New York Times Opinion, I'm Lydia Polgreen.
I'm Ross Douthat.
I'm Carlos Lozada.
And this is Matter of Opinion. Well, surprise, surprise, it didn't take long for Kamala Harris's identity to be politicized now that she's running for president. Just this week, Trump questioned her racial identity at a black journalist conference, insisting that she wasn't really black.
I didn't know she was black until a number of years ago when she happened to turn black, and now she wants to be known as black. So I don't know, is she Indian or is she black?
She is always identified as a black woman. She went to a historically black college.
I respect either one, but she obviously doesn't, because she was Indian all the way, and then all of a sudden she made a turn, and she became a black person.
Just to be clear, sir, do you believe that she is...
I think somebody should look into that, too, when you continue in a very hostile, nasty tone.
And at the same time, race and gender seem to be animating Harris supporters. Have either of you guys seen merch for White Dudes for Harris? Have you stocked up? Or Carlos, maybe the Latinos for Harris is more your speed?
Carlos was on both of those calls, right? In a tribute to the complexity of identity.
Yeah.
Right?
You know, when did I just become Peruvian? Did I turn Peruvian? What am I? Someone should look into that.
Well, listen, the good news is that there are people to look into that, and those people are us. We are going to break out our calipers and really get down to it. So today, I want to talk more about how we even define identity and what's changing about identity politics on the left and also on the right. But I want to start with talking about something that I've noticed about the Harris campaign, which is that despite the path-breaking nature of her candidacy, she's obviously, aiming to be the first female president. She would certainly be the first South Asian president. She'd be the first black woman president. Harris has not been talking much about identity on the stump. I'm curious, what are you hearing in terms of how she is talking about or not talking about identity in this campaign?
I mean, I've been reading her books, and it's interesting how she talks about her identity in those contexts. Of course, her father from Jamaica, her mother from India. In her first book, which came out in 2009, she talks about traveling to both countries as a child. When she'd go to Jamaica, she talks about sitting on her grandmother's front porch, chewing on sugarcane, and hearing her dad and her uncles talk about the history of slavery and colonialism. When they go to India, she says she hear her grandfather and his friends talk about, politics and complain about corruption. She rarely talks about herself in sort of overtly kind of racial or ethnic terms. It's always about the ideas and values she got from these different worlds. In her second book, which came out a decade later in 2019, when she was about to run for president, she's far more willing or comfortable to talk about her racial identity. She says that her mother instilled pride in her South Asian roots, in her and her sister. She talks about her classical Indian name, says she was raised with a strong awareness and appreciation for Indian culture. But then she just says point blank, look, my mother understood that she was raising two black daughters, and she knew that the United States would see Maya, her sister, and Kamala herself as black girls. And her mom was determined that she was going to raise two confident, proud black women. And that is the path that she embraced. And she's willing and able to talk about it pretty overtly, at least in writing. That may be different now that she's on the stump.
Yeah, I mean, Ross, are you surprised that she hasn't sort of made more of the kind of Hillary style I'm with her pitch to the country?
Well, I mean, one, we're a week to 10 days into the Harris campaign, right? I think it's a little early to sort of assess completely what her mode of engagement is. I mean, I think that there certainly has been a certain amount of specifically African-American cultural energy that the campaign has tried to draw on.
Sure, I think Megan Thee Stallion,
right?
And,
I mean, I think the big,
I
think the big rally in Atlanta, sort of the black middle class capital of the United States, in the heart of a state that she really needs to run up big margins with African American voters to win. It felt like she was very much an African American candidate, sort of in that environment. That said, I agree that this is not being rolled out primarily as a path-breaking, ceiling-shattering candidacy. And I think there are three good reasons for that. One is that Harris is trying to evoke Barack Obama in various ways. But if you're doing that, it's the case that, like, Obama already became the first Black president. So that particular barrier has been broken. And then the Hillary campaign is remembered as a famous disaster, right? So you're not going to say, I want to be the first Black president because Obama already did it. And you're not going to say, I'm with her because Hillary Clinton lost. You're trying to grope for some other way of sort of using identity effectively. And that's the other thing, which is that this is a really weird thing where there was no primary campaign. I think Carlos said, in leading up to her primary candidacy, she invoked race and identity more. I think that's
she never even made it to Iowa.
Right. Yeah. But had we gone through a full primary campaign where she was a successful candidate, I mean, for God's sake, her biggest moment in the primary campaign was telling Joe Biden,
I do not believe you are a racist, but I also believe, and it's personal, and it was hurtful to hear you talk about the reputations of two United States senators who built their reputations and career on the segregation of race in this country. And it was not only that, but you also worked with them to oppose busing. And there was a little girl in California who was part of the second class to integrate her public schools. And she was bused to school every day. And that little girl was me.
So she was trying to play identity cards, race cards, and so on. But now there's no primary. There's no sort of competition for the Democratic base beyond trying to energize it. And I think her campaign knows that she needs to win a lot of, let's call them, pro-choice, blue-collar moderates who are mostly white in Midwestern states. And I think it would be weird if her primary appeal to them was vote for this path-breaking minority candidate.
I think it's worth just backing up and talking about Obama a little bit more because, I think that there was simultaneously a kind of light and I think pretty deft touch to the way that he talked about his identity. But I mean, this is a guy who wrote a book called Dreams from My Father, who could forget the skinny kid with a funny name line. And I think that he had a way of, a cynical way to describe it was, sort of flattering white Americans about their broad-mindedness in their openness to him. We're a long way away from 2008, but I don't know. Is it worth just thinking a little bit about how Obama broached the issue of his identity? Maybe, Carlos, you have some thoughts on this, having performed a few close reads of Obama's oeuvre.
That's the word he would use too.
Listen, I'm coastal liberal. What can I say? I like arugula.
I think there are interesting parallels and differences between Obama and Harris. Both Harris and Obama are born of Black fathers from other countries, right? And if you read Dreams from My Father, like you said, if you read David Maraniss's biography of Obama, you see how Obama really slowly pieced together his identity as a Black man, right? There were moments early in his life when he saw himself as more multicultural, more international. When he's at Columbia University, New York, his close friends are sort of the international students, the Pakistani expats, right? It's really in Chicago, in his community organizer days and his Trinity Church days, that he sort of fully identifies with a Black American community. And developing that identity is, in some ways, it's a cultural exercise, also an intellectual exercise for him. Also a political one. And, in David Garrow's biography of Obama, he describes how Obama felt he would have to marry a Black woman in order to be credible politically for Black voters in Chicago. I think we know less about how Harris has wrestled with this throughout her life. I'm sure there will be new biographies coming. Obviously, she's married to a white man. She attended the most famous traditionally Black college in America, and Howard, as part of Alpha Kappa Alpha, powerhouse Black sorority. But I think in both cases, there is an element of this sort of identity creation of a dilemma of options that is not necessarily present for all of Black America.
I think there is a kind of fascinating dynamic where, you started out talking about Donald Trump's comments about Harris's racial and ethnic background and him saying, she used to be South Asian and now she's black. How did that happen, right? And that represents many things. It's a very, very, very Trumpian comment, but it is, among other things, an example of Trump and doing something that he didn't really do at all in 2016, which is he's actually trying to make a play for African-American voters with that statement, as strange as that may sound. I think the Trump campaign really hopes that there's a subset of, sort of socially conservative African-American voters who look at Harris and don't see themselves in her. Now, I don't think Trump's method of raising that issue is likely to be effective, but that's, I think, what he thought he was doing, right? He thought he was doing outreach to a certain kind of African-American voter in the same way that the Harris campaign is hoping to do outreach to white voters in Pennsylvania or Michigan with its vice presidential pick, which it's just a very interesting state of affairs.
Well, to call it outreach, I mean, it's, one way to do outreach to a certain set of voters is to offer policies and ideas and initiatives that can benefit those voters. Another is to denigrate your opponent by saying, wink, wink, she's not really one of you. I mean, it's a very crude, Trumpian
it's not
form of voter outreach.
Okay, sure, but we've just gone through a week where the main Democratic form of voter outreach has been to call the Republican ticket weirdos and freaks. So let's not overstate the high-mindedness of the Democratic Party.
I never did.
Moment.
I was suggesting you were overstating the high-mindedness of Trump's thoughtful inquiry into racial dynamics.
Well, it's based on I think a really profound misunderstanding of the Black electorate, right? I mean, I think reticence about Barack Obama was less about, is he one of us, than a deep and profound and I think very valid fear that a Black candidate just couldn't win in America. And when I've been out on the campaign trail talking to voters, particularly to Black voters, their concern about Kamala Harris I've never had a single voter say to me, well, she's not really Black. It's, are white people ready to vote for a Black woman is the core fear. So yeah, Trump may think of it as outreach, but it's outreach based on just like an incredibly impoverished, view of how, Black people think about their own identity, how Black people think. I mean, it's crazy to me, the idea that she's not really Black seems to be sort of rooted in this absurd notion about how identity works, that somehow that her Indian identity somehow takes over for her Black identity or is like more real than her Black identity.
Wait a minute. I mean, yes, again, I just want to stipulate, Trump is Trump. His framing of it was ridiculous. Of course, you can have multiple identities. Of course, she's just biracial and is both African American and South Asian. That goes without saying. But don't you think that there is a sort of understood difference for a lot of African Americans between the experience of, let's say, African immigrants to the U.S. and the experience of descendants of American slaves? I mean, I think there are real...
but I don't think that is a primary motivating factor here. And what I think is at the heart of this "she is not Black" thing is this kind of accusation of a kind of stolen valor. So the right wants to think that people on the left are obsessed with oppression and want to claim the most oppressed identity. And so therefore, if someone is saying, oh, I'm Black, but they're actually some other heritage, what they're doing is asserting an oppressed identity that they don't really possess. And I'm struck, and this is, I don't know, maybe you're going to think this sounds conspiratorial, but I'm struck by the fact that Trump's campaign manager is this guy, Chris LaCivita, who, sort of rose to prominence and became quite famous for the swift boating of John Kerry. And what was the heart of that attack? This guy claims to be a war hero, but he's not actually really who he says he was. And it, turns out it was all just fake. And, John Kerry really was a brave soldier and did all of the things that he said that he did. But I think that this effort to undermine Kamala Harris's, absolutely legitimate, clear claim to Black American identity is part of just this broken brain right-wing obsession with believing that the left is somehow interested in playing this kind of oppression Olympics thing.
But as we just discussed, the main big moment of the Harris presidential campaign in 2020 was using the African American experience of segregated schools against Joe Biden and claiming that her personal experience, I was that little girl, was itself an experience of oppression that Joe Biden was responsible for. I mean, I don't think conservatives are wrong to see some efforts on the left at claiming degrees of oppression as sort of, vindication for a particular thing. I mean, again, of course, it's exaggerated by conservatives, just as liberals perhaps exaggerate things about the right. And I don't think Harris is doing that in this particular moment. I agree that her campaign so far has not done anything like that. But I do think there was some elements of that, some strong elements of that in her campaign last time.
Well, we're talking about her campaign this time.
Now, she's dealing with race now in ways that are sort of more subtle while still obvious, right? She talks about voting rights, about, the importance of, the sacred freedom to vote, the freedom to live free of bigotry, the freedom to acknowledge our full history and learn from it. She says stuff like, well, I don't have to tell you folks in Atlanta, the generations before us led the fight for freedom. I mean, like, it's a reference to Martin Luther King Jr. at Ebenezer Baptist. Her audiences all know what she means, but she doesn't say it explicitly, right? It's not like, as a Black person, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's the same with abortion rights. Democrats say she's a better messenger than Biden on the issue, in part because Biden was not always comfortable with it. Unstated is like, and Kamala Harris is a woman, and therefore she can talk about it. Like, they're being, it's both very, very obvious, but at the same time, trying to be kind of unstated in the way she talks about race and gender. And I think that is a difference from, her efforts in 2019. I think that the party's in a different place. Maybe the country's in a different place. And she is sort of moving with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are, according to one statistic that I saw, there are something like 40 million biracial Americans, including the children of the vice presidential candidate of Donald Trump. And I think that Americans are, much more comfortable with the idea of holding multiple identities. Now, it turns out that actually there's more diversity in terms of nationality or national origin on my father's side. My father's a white American, than there is on my mother's, and my mother is from Ethiopia. I grew up hearing about my Cornish roots, my roots in Scandinavia, all of these different branches of my family. So I think there is a kind of comfort in the United States in talking about identity in this much more broad way that includes national origin, that includes, things that aren't necessarily, strictly speaking, about race or gender. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk more about how Trump and the Republican Party are leveraging identity in this election. And we're back. So I want to dig in a little more on the other side of the ticket. There's a way that focusing on Kamala Harris alone really obscures how Trump and the Republicans employ identity politics in subtle and not so subtle ways. For example, Trump's running mate, J.D. Vance, is a very interesting political figure who is, of course, in a multicultural marriage with biracial children, something that, has certainly come up in the campaign. So I'm curious, what do you guys think is Trump's model of identity politics?
I mean, I think we've seen Trump has been a figure now on the national stage for long enough that we've seen multiple models, and he sort of moves back and forth between them. I think the 2016 campaign was very much a kind of white identity politics campaign, this incredibly strong emphasis on sort of the forgotten, mostly white working class voters of the Rust Belt, joined to, sort of obviously, the immigration issue as a centerpiece. Then there's also been increasingly a sort of Trumpian outreach to minority voters, which has been much more successful, I think, than lots of liberals and Democrats would have expected back in 2016. And I think that has been, less about identity politics and more about a kind of anti-left politics. And Trump has spent, and his campaigns have spent, a certain amount of time trying to say, look, the Democrats are the party of woke progressivism, and they act like all minority voters are woke progressives, and they're not. And we're here for you if you just, love the USA and want to do well here. That's sort of an Americanist identity politics, and if you will, but it's quite different, I think, and coexists in a weird way with the original appeal of 2016.
Yeah, I think that it was always a fiction that, the right seems to have finally disabused itself of, that, more non-white immigrants was going to mean a more liberal or more progressive country. It should not surprise anyone that people who, see themselves as having come here, quote unquote, legally, look at those who they see as coming here, quote unquote, illegally as being cheaters or something like that. So that sort of politics discourse doesn't surprise me. And it also doesn't surprise me that, immigrants, whether they're from Latin America or from Africa or other parts of the world, where they could come from much more conservative religious traditions, would have, shared values with the Republican Party. And I can imagine a candidate who could actually embody and embrace both of those trends and make, real inroads with those types of voters.
Is that candidate in the race?
That candidate, I don't believe, is in the race.
Okay.
I think that Donald Trump is, really kind of the wrong messenger for that message. Could J.D. Vance be the candidate who could really make that case? I think probably yes, although I think he probably needs to think about some of the things that he's been saying about, Mountain Dew and racism, and have his eyes more clearly focused on the prize. But sure, I think that that's a coalition that could be put together. The question is, does it hold together the kind of what I would call the kind of Haktua vote, this like quite vulgar edge that we see in a lot of the kind of Trump coalition? I'm not so sure. But those identities, I think, could all be spoken to by various candidates. But I don't think that candidate is Donald Trump.
A couple of quick thoughts on that. One is that I don't think it's solely the Republicans who have had to disabuse themselves of the notion that immigrants would necessarily be Democrats. I think that there was plenty on the left in that kind of rhetoric as well. On the Trump side, I'm less inclined to see the discontinuities, as Ross does, than to see the continuities in Trump's sort of lines of attack. What he said about Harris this week just reminded me almost exactly of his old birtherism attacks on Obama. Then, the whole, I'm just asking questions, someone should look into that. That is exactly what he said, years ago, long before 2016, about Barack Obama. And now he's doing the same thing with Harris. The someone should look into that is a tried and true, Trumpian line. And it feels like a remarkable lack of imagination or a confidence that those attacks, worked then and will work now.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, but then by the same token, even in Trump's first term in office, there was sort of these, fascinating tensions, right, where he was, the sort of candidate pitted against the corruptions of urban America and the fear of voter fraud, while also signing a criminal justice reform bill and attacking Democrats from the left. So there's always been, part of it is just that sort of Trump is not a man of deep ideological conviction, except on a few issues. And so he can sort of shift back and forth depending on the last person he talked to. And if the last person he talked to was Jared Kushner and Kim Kardashian, he was all for criminal justice reform and winning the African-American vote. And if the last person he talked to was Stephen Miller, then he had a different perspective, right? So that's always been there.
Yeah, I think what you're describing is actually what the kids call code switching, right? Speaking to different parts of your identity, with different audiences, with different parts of your identity. And I think that there has been an effort to paint Kamala Harris as someone who is essentially putting on an identity that, she's really Indian, but she's pretending to be Black in order to, as I said earlier, kind of have this stolen valor of being part of an oppressed class. And I think that, that line of attack might work if it wasn't just so clearly instrumental in Trump's case, right? He'll just use whatever is at hand to hammer whatever is the convenient thing. And so if you're trying to create this kind of coherent critique of Kamala Harris, which is it? Is she an Indian woman who's racist against Black men and wants to throw them in prison? Or is she a radical leftist who wants to let Black Lives Matter and Antifa burn down all of our great American cities? I mean, I guess you could say that the answer could be both, right? But depending on which the audience is, and that Trump can just kind of get away with code switching. I just think that he's much clumsier at it than, say, someone who's deeply practiced like Kamala Harris.
Lydia, do you see the stolen valor thing as connected to, how does that match up with the sort of Kamala Harris as the quote-unquote DEI candidate?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think that it's been an undercurrent, particularly in the way that J.D. Vance has talked about identity and Trump as well. I feel like there's this kind of undergirding sense that there is this inverted pyramid of oppression that is the actual pyramid of oppression, and that the radical left is trying to tell you that white men are the oppressors. But if you actually look at the way that oppression works in society today, the libs have all the power, and it's white men who are being most sort of fundamentally oppressed. And an example of that is that someone like Kamala Harris, who has, in this narrative, only gotten to where she is in life by a system of excluding worthy white men and promoting minorities and women and people like that, that's the only reason why she is in the position that she is at running for president. So I think that that's kind of the broader narrative into which that thinking fits.
But I think there's also sort of, again, this is just it's a very weird situation we're in, where we didn't have a primary campaign.
That's a very popular adjective these days.
It's very weird.
Everything
it's all
is so weird,
right? We didn't have a primary campaign. Harris is sort of leaping onto the stage without having had, the normal year of agitation and argument about what her policy platform actually is. And so her opponents are sort of trying to figure out where she is settling in order to figure out where they would settle in a line of attack, right? And that's part of what you're seeing here too, right? There is a narrative where Kamala Harris is sort of the embodiment of the extremes that progressives went to in 2020, where she's a candidate who took a ton of left-wing positions, only has her office because of, the context of the George Floyd protests, and is just she's the queen of woke. You could imagine a campaign run that way. But Harris, smartly, is currently shaking the Etch-a-Sketch and running away from a lot of the positions that she took during the Great Awakening.
Kind of like J.D. Vance did with Trump. It's amazing.
Well, I mean, yes, to an extent. I think the Vance evolution is less about positions and more about Trump himself. But yeah, I think Harris is doing absolutely the smart thing in moving away from her past positions, but then the Republican response has to adapt to that. They can't just say she's the queen of woke if she's not taking the woke positions, right? They have to say, oh, she's someone who's always changing her identity depending on where liberalism happens to be. And there maybe she's Indian one minute and she's African-American the next. Maybe that attack is seen as fitting into that kind of oh, she's a chameleon, you can't trust her, she's always changing her positions. But these are quite different lines of attack that are going to take shape depending on what Harris does in, again, this relatively short amount of time.
I think the DEI candidate attack, this notion that she's undeserving and she only received her position in a sort of summer 2020 panic-inspired George Floyd era. I find it strange. I mean, as usual, more than one thing can be true at the same time, right? In 2020, Joe Biden said very explicitly, openly, that he wanted to name a woman as vice president or a person of color, right? It was not some sort of hidden agenda. It's something he said. He said it about the Supreme Court. More recently, he said that diversity and inclusion are among core strengths of America. And he highlighted the diversity in his administration, including at the top with the VP. So the notion that this was a factor when naming Harris seems sort of unambiguous. But the only reason she would be in the mix was because she had been a DA, a state attorney general, a U.S. senator. She had merited being in the mix for the top job. So these things don't have to be opposed to each other. They can coexist.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that the presumption when we talk about diversity in terms of diversifying the ticket is that, and the vice president has throughout our history until 2020 been a white man, that you're picking often primarily on the basis of identity among a group of candidates who are presumed to be qualified. And I think that it's telling that when you make a pick based on identity that involves a person of color or a woman, that the presumption is that that person is quite likely not qualified and has only been given that position as a result of it. And look, I mean, the reality is that there are fewer people to choose from, right? Because historically, women and people of color there have just been fewer of them. So I think that's one way in which it is fundamentally different. But I think the presumption is that ultimately anyone who gets to that point of consideration has merits that make them worthy of that consideration.
Yeah, of course, it's totally normal to pick a vice president for identity politics reasons. But the perception in Harris's case was that she was picked for identity reasons and she had not been doing a good job in either the presidential candidate role or the VP role. Now, again, we've put all that behind us.
She wasn't.
That was all. It was all 2 weeks ago, right? But that was key. It was the Dan Quayle phenomenon, where Quayle was a white man who was picked because the Bush campaign thought he resembled John F. Kennedy, and then he became perceived as incompetent very quickly. I think the point about her alleged record of incompetence is useful for pundits like me to bring up to sort of,
right.
But it's not really relevant to the presidential race anymore. No, she'll either do well or she doesn't. That's all.
I think her stock, it's hard to imagine her stock being higher than it is right now,
Yes.
Getting higher than it is right now. I mean, I think what she's shown is enormous political acumen in being able to sort of marshal the party behind her so quickly and with such sort of total uniformity. Obama took a little while. It's funny, like we've talking about the parallels with Barack Obama. It took him a little bit longer to come around, but I think the pitfalls all lie ahead. This is like the very beginning of a wonderful relationship for the Democrats. Like everything is just fun and exciting and new, and then we'll see how it really develops.
But this is where I now come in to return to my original position and say it's not that early, right? So if you were going to make the bullish case, you would say that for a politician with some severe limits that we've seen throughout her career, this is the best runway she could possibly have to get to a November election.
Well, the good news is that she's running against not just one, but two politicians who have shown themselves to also have very severe limits. So I guess we'll see how.
Is this your transition to childless cat ladies, Lydia?
As a childless dog lady, I can certainly take my corner in that boxing match. All right, let's leave it there. And when we come back, hot and cold. And finally, it's time for hot cold. So who's going to be taking the temperature this week?
I am hot colding today, and it's something I was really hot on, and then I became ice cold on. So I'm both hot and cold here. So like many people on this fair planet, I've been watching the Olympics, not everything, but some events. I really love the table tennis and triathlon in particular. Those are sports that I care about. But I've always been particularly inspired by the torch lighting ceremony. Some of the most thrilling moments, Olympic moments in my lifetime came in the 90s with the torch lighting. In 92 in Barcelona, when the archer ignited the cauldron by shooting a burning arrow over it. 4 years later, amazing and thrilling Muhammad Ali lighting the torch in Atlanta. Those to me are sort of signature moments in the Olympics as much as any sporting event. So when I watched the torch lighting ceremony for Paris, I was blown away. It was meant to commemorate the first manned hot air balloon flight, which was done by a pair of Frenchmen in the 1780s. And my family and I, we were just riveted watching this. Like it looked like a hot air balloon hovering high over Paris, held up by a flaming cauldron underneath. Except it wasn't.
What?
It was actually a cloud of mist and beams of light creating the illusion of a flaming cauldron. The Times reported that the flame, which it correctly puts in quotation marks, the flame actually was 40 LED spotlights and 200 misting nozzles. It was not a flame.
Wow.
And that crushed me when I found out. Apparently, it's a safety issue, an environmental issue, whatever, but I don't care. The Olympic cauldron must be on fire. I was so disappointed. I felt duped, right? The flame is a beautiful tradition. It dates back to I think it's like the 1928 games in Amsterdam, paying homage to the flame the ancient Olympians had lit during the game in honor of the hearth goddess Hestia. And now it's like a glorified laser light show, and that feels wrong to me. This isn't Epcot Center. This is the Olympics. Have a real flame. To see it and think it was real and then be told that it wasn't has just really dampened my Olympic spirit. It has turned me from hot to cold on this part of the games that I really love. I still love the Olympics. Way to go, Paris. I'm just having a hard time getting past the cauldron.
I could not agree with you more. In fact, I am going to come out on this podcast right now to say that I have one point of agreement with Donald Trump, and it is that I hate LED light bulbs and think that they give off terrible light. So there's the crime that it's not a flame, but then there's also the additional crime that it's done with LED lights, which do not create warm, realistic light.
I assume that you guys are not just engaged in some epic exercise to bait me into making a comment about the actual controversy.
Oh, we know where this
Olympic
is going.
opening ceremony, but I'm going to decline to take the bait and just say that I'm glad you mentioned Trump, Lydia, because I was about to say that rant from Carlos would fit brilliantly into a Trump speech in between the complaints about rising shark populations, the objections to wind turbines, the analysis of the problems of LED lights, and the challenge of low-flow toilets.
Yeah.
Have you guys seen, do you remember Adam Sandler's movie, The Wedding Singer?
Of course.
Did you guys watch this?
I haven't seen it in years.
An American classic.
It's an American classic. So
Julia, your name is going to be Julia
Gulia. Remember he wrote like half the love song when he was still engaged to his fiancée and then finished it after she had left him at the altar? Right? That famous song that Adam Sandler sang. So it's all about how much he loves her. And suddenly he screams, but it was all bullshit. You know, like, it was a goddamn joke. And that's how I feel about the cauldron. It was all bullshit.
All right, guys. Well, it has been a joy to speak with you. Talk to you soon.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining our conversation. Give Matter of Opinion a follow on your favorite podcast app and leave us a nice review while you're there to let other people know why they should listen. Do you have a question for us about the selection? We want to hear it. Share it with us in a voicemail by calling 212-556-7440, and we might just respond to it in an upcoming episode. You can also email us at matterofopinion@nytimes.com. Matter of Opinion is produced by Sophia Alvarez-Boyd, Phoebe Lett, and Andrea Betanzos. It is edited by Jordana Hochman. Our fact-check team is Kate Sinclair, Mary Marge Locker, and Michelle Harris. Original music by Isaac Jones, Afim Shapiro, Carol Saburo, Aman Sahota, and Pat McCusker. Mixing by Pat McCusker and Carol Saburo. Audience strategy by Shannon Busta and Christina Samuelewski. Our executive producer is Annie Rose Strasser.